The man carried water up the hill in silence, his boots pressed into frozen earth with the rhythm of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times before. The wooden buckets swung at his sides, leather straps cutting into shoulders that no longer registered pain. He did not look back at the settlement below. He never did. The valley stretched gray and lifeless beneath a sky the color of old iron, and somewhere in that expanse of cold indifference, voices called him what they always called him. He did not answer. He reached the stone hut at the summit and set the buckets down with care. The door hung crooked on its frame. Inside, dried herbs swung from blackened beams, and a fire barely held against the wind that pushed through cracks in the walls. He knelt and added wood with hands that moved like ritual. Then he stopped. On the threshold lay a piece of torn fabric, dark with blood. The man carried water up the hill in silence, his boots pressed into frozen earth with the rhythm of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times before. The wooden buckets swung at his sides, leather straps cutting into shoulders that no longer registered pain. He did not look back at the settlement below. He never did. The valley stretched gray and lifeless beneath a sky the color of old iron, and somewhere in that expanse of cold indifference, voices called him what they always called him. He did not answer. He reached the stone hut at the summit and set the buckets down with care. The door hung crooked on its frame. Inside, dried herbs swung from blackened beams, and a fire barely held against the wind that pushed through cracks in the walls. He knelt and added wood with hands that moved like ritual. Then he stopped. On the threshold lay a piece of torn fabric, dark with blood. It had not been there when he descended. The man lived alone because he chose to. The others in the valley believed he hid from something, that fear drove him to the barren summit where wind stripped the land to bone. They were wrong. He had not fled. He had removed himself. There was a difference, though none of them possessed the patience to understand it. His days followed a pattern older than memory. He rose before light touched the mountains. He gathered what the land offered and took nothing more. He spoke to no one. At night he sat by the fire and listened to the silence that men feared and he had learned to trust. His face carried the marks of a life lived without compromise. Deep lines framed eyes that had seen enough to stop asking questions. His hair, long and streaked with gray, fell past shoulders broad enough to carry more than water. He wore wool and leather worn thin by use, and around his neck hung a pendant of carved bone that no longer held meaning for anyone but him. The settlement below had tried to pull him back once. They sent a woman with offers of shelter and a place at their table. He thanked her and closed the door. They sent a man with threats of what winter would do to a fool on a hill. He listened and said nothing. Eventually, they stopped sending anyone. He became a story they told to explain why some men could not be saved. The fabric on his threshold was not random. Someone had placed it there with intention. The blood was still wet enough to darken his fingers when he lifted it. He studied the weave, the pattern of the tear, the way it had been folded to display the stain. This was a message. He stood and scanned the slopes below. Nothing moved. The valley held its breath beneath clouds that pressed down like a hand. He knew the feel of being watched. It was a pressure in the chest, a weight behind the eyes. He felt it now. Somewhere in the rocks or among the twisted trees that clung to the lower ridges, someone waited. They had been there for hours, perhaps days. Patience like that came from discipline or desperation. He returned inside and bolted the door. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow that had not yet fallen. He did not sleep that night. He sat with his back to the stone wall and listened to the silence rearrange itself around a presence that did not belong. Morning came without sun. The sky remained locked in gray, and when he stepped outside, footprints circled his hut in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. They came from the east, moved around the structure 3 times, then returned the way they came. He followed them down the slope until they vanished into a dry riverbed choked with stones. Whoever left them knew how to hide. He returned to the hut and found a second piece of fabric. This one hung from the branch of a dead tree 50 paces from his door. It fluttered in the wind like a banner. He took it down and held it to the light. The same blood, the same weave. He understood now. This was not a threat. It was a test. Someone wanted to know what kind of man lived on the hill, whether he would panic or investigate, whether he would descend to the valley or remain in place. He burned both pieces of fabric in his fire and continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He carried water, he mended the roof where winter had begun its assault. He did not alter his rhythm. By the 3rd day, a figure appeared at the base of the hill. She stood motionless in the clearing where the path began. Tall and lean, she wore furs stitched with symbols he recognized from the northern clans. Her hair, dark as wet earth, hung in a single braid that reached past her waist. Her face carried the sharp beauty of someone who had never softened for comfort, all angles and shadows beneath eyes that measured distance like a hunter. She did not call out. She simply waited. He descended slowly, keeping his hands visible. When he reached the clearing, she studied him with the same patience he had felt in the watching. Her clothing fit close to her body, practical but deliberate. Leather traced the line of her hips and chest, and the gap at her collar showed skin marked with ink that told stories he could not read. She was not there by accident. She was not lost. "You helped one of ours," she said. Her voice carried the texture of stone grinding stone. 3 nights ago, a boy with a broken leg. He remembered. A child had crawled to his door in darkness, shivering and incoherent. He had set the bone, wrapped it, given the boy water and a place by the fire. In the morning, the child was gone. He had thought nothing of it. "He made it back," she continued. "He told us what you did." "I did what anyone would do." "No. You did what we needed to see." She moved closer. The wind pulled at her furs and revealed more of the ink that covered her arms. Her presence filled the space between them with something that was not aggression, but was not peace either. She carried no visible weapons, but her hands moved with the controlled stillness of someone who did not need them. "We have been here a month, watching your people, watching you. We needed to know if there was honor left in this valley. I am not one of them. We know. That is why we tested you." He waited. She reached into her furs and withdrew a small carved figure, no larger than a child's fist. It depicted a wolf mid-leap, every line precise and intentional. She placed it in his palm. "This is our way of saying we see you. We see what you are." He held the carving and felt its weight. "What do you want?" "Nothing yet, but a storm is coming. When it arrives, you will understand why we needed to know." She turned and walked back into the trees without another word. He stood in the clearing until the cold forced him to move. The carving remained in his hand, warm as if it had been held against skin. That night he placed it on the shelf beside his fire and watched shadows dance across its surface.
2 days later, the settlement sent men up the hill. There were 5 of them, armed with axes and the kind of anger that comes from fear, poorly hidden. Their leader was a man named Torsten, thick through the chest and jaw, with eyes that had never learned to see past what threatened him. He stopped 10 paces from the hut and spat into the dirt. "We know they were here," Torsten said. "We know you spoke with them." The man at the door said nothing. "They are raiders, savages from the north. They killed a family 2 valleys over and burned their hall." "I heard no such thing." "You hear nothing up here, old man. That is the problem. You sit in your hole and pretend the world does not exist." "The world exists fine without my attention." Torsten stepped closer. His men spread out, forming a loose arc. "They are planning something. We can feel it. And you, speaking with them, taking their gifts, that makes you part of it." "I took no gift. I helped the child. Their child. That makes you a traitor." The word hung in the air like smoke. The man at the door felt the familiar weight of other men's judgment and found it lighter than it used to be. He had carried worse. "Leave my hill," he said quietly. "We will leave when we are ready, and when this is over, when we have driven them out or buried them, we will remember who stood where." Torsten turned and led his men back down the path, their voices carried on the wind, full of plans and promises of violence. The man watched them go and understood that the storm the woman spoke of was not weather, it was men. Men with fear in their hearts and righteousness in their mouths, men who would burn the world to feel safe. That night the wind changed. It came from the north now, carrying the scent of ice and distance. He stepped outside and saw fires in the valley below, not the warm glow of hearths, but the sharp points of torches being organized. They were preparing. He returned inside and sat by his own fire. The carved wolf watched him from the shelf. He thought about the boy with the broken leg. He thought about the woman with ink on her skin and patience in her eyes. He thought about Torsten and his men, and the settlement that had named him coward because he would not join their fear. He had removed himself from such choices long ago, but the choices, it seemed, had followed him up the hill. The snow began before dawn. It came quietly at first, soft flakes that melted on contact. By midday, it fell in sheets that erased the valley from view. He stood at his door and watched the world disappear into white. Somewhere below, Torsten and his men would be moving. Somewhere in the rocks, the woman and her people would be waiting. And here, on the hill, a man who wanted no part of either stood at the center of something he could no longer avoid. The temperature dropped. The wind howled. The storm the woman promised had arrived, and it carried more than snow. He prepared as he always did. He brought in extra wood. He secured the door and the shutters. He filled every container with water and checked the integrity of the walls. Then he did something he had not done in years. He took down the pendant from around his neck and held it to the firelight. It was a raven carved from bone, wings spread wide. He had worn it since the day he walked away from his old life, from the wars and the blood and the endless demands that he be something other than himself. It reminded him why he chose the hill, why he chose silence. But now the silence was broken, and he had to decide what that meant. The knock came after dark. 3 sharp strikes, deliberate and clear. He opened the door to find the woman standing in snow that already reached her knees. Behind her, barely visible through the storm, were shapes, people. She stepped inside without asking, and he let her. Her furs dripped water onto the stone floor. Her face showed no sign of cold. "They are coming. Your people. They mean to attack us tonight while the storm hides their approach." "They are not my people." "Then whose are you?" The question cut deeper than she intended. He had no answer that satisfied even himself. "We can defend ourselves," she continued, "but the storm will bury anyone caught outside. Your settlement, our camp, it does not matter. The mountain does not care about sides." "Then why are you here?" "Because you have shelter, because you are between us and them, and because I believe you understand what I am about to ask." He waited. "Let my people shelter here, just until the storm passes. We will not harm you. We will leave when it is safe. And if Torsten comes, then you will have to choose." There it was, the choice he had spent years avoiding. He could turn her away and remain neutral. He could let whatever happened below happen without his involvement. Or he could open his door and accept the cost of mercy. He looked past her to the shapes in the snow. Women, children, old men with frost in their beards. Not raiders, not savages, just people, caught between a storm and men with torches. "How many?" he asked. 15.
His hut could barely hold 5 comfortably, but comfort was not the question being asked. "Bring them in." She did not thank him. She simply turned and called into the storm. They came slowly, one by one, shaking snow from their shoulders and stomping feeling back into their feet. They filled the small space until there was no room to move. They sat against the walls and huddled together for warmth. The children stared at him with wide eyes. The old men nodded their respect. The woman stood by the door, watching the storm through the cracks. "They will know we are here," she said. "I know. They will call you worse than coward. I know." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "Why did you leave them?" she asked. "Because they wanted me to be something I was not." "And what are you?" "A man who carries water up a hill." She almost smiled, almost. The storm raged through the night. The wind tore at the walls, and the snow piled against the door until it could not be opened. Inside, the fire burned low. The people huddled close and shared what little food they had. No one spoke. Outside, the world became a white void where direction lost meaning and distance became measured in heartbeats. And somewhere in that void, Torsten and his men were moving.
The attack came just before dawn. Not on the hut, but on the northern camp. The man heard the shouts through the storm, distant and distorted. The woman stood and moved to the door, her body tense. "They found the camp empty," she said. "They will know where we are now." He nodded. "Then they will come here." The people inside shifted uneasily. Some of the old men reached for weapons they had left behind. The woman placed a hand on one man's shoulder and shook her head. "No blood in this place," she said. "It is not ours to defend that way." The man who owned the hut stood and faced her. "If they come through that door with violence, what will you do?" "What we must, but we will not start it." He believed her. He had seen enough violence to know the difference between those who sought it and those who prepared for it. He returned to the fire and waited. Torsten arrived with the first light. The storm had weakened enough to reveal shapes moving up the hill. 6 men, axes in hand, pushing through snow that reached their waists. They surrounded the hut, and Torsten hammered on the door. "We know they're in there. Send them out." The man inside did not move. "This is your last chance. Open the door or we will break it down." The woman looked at him. The people looked at him. 15 lives pressed against his silence, waiting to see what a man who carried water would do when forced to carry something heavier. He walked to the door and lifted the bolt. The cold rushed in like a living thing. Torsten stood in the threshold, snow crusted in his beard, rage burning in his eyes. "Step aside," Torsten said. "No." The word hung between them, simple, absolute. "These people are raiders, killers." "These people are sheltering from a storm. They are the enemy. They are people, the same as you." Torsten raised his axe. "I will go through you if I must." The man did not move. Behind him, the woman placed her hand on his shoulder, not to pull him back, but to stand with him. The people inside rose to their feet, not to fight, to witness. And in that moment, Torsten saw what he had come to destroy. Not savages, not enemies, just people trying to survive a storm in the only shelter available. He saw the old men and the children. He saw the woman with her hand on the shoulder of a man who owed her nothing. And he saw that man, standing in his own doorway, refusing to move not because he was brave, but because he had finally found something worth not moving for. Torsten lowered his axe. His men shifted uneasily behind him. "You are a fool," Torsten said. "Perhaps,"
They will remember this. Your people will remember. I have no people. I have a hill and a fire and a door I choose to open. Torsten stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into the snow. His men followed. They disappeared into the white, and the storm swallowed their voices. The man closed the door and bolted it again. Inside, the people breathed. The woman removed her hand from his shoulder, but did not step away. That was not wisdom, she said. No, but it was right. The storm lasted 2 more days. When it finally cleared, the world emerged buried and transformed. The valley lay under 6 feet of snow. The settlement was half collapsed, roofs caved in under the weight. The northern camp was gone entirely, erased as if it had never existed. The people in the hut left one by one, trudging down the hill toward whatever remained of their lives. The woman was the last to go. She stood at the door and looked at the man who had given them shelter. "We will not forget this," she said. "I ask for no debt. It is not a debt, it is a fact." She reached into her furs and withdrew another carving, smaller than the first, a raven, wings folded. She placed it beside the wolf on his shelf. 2 ravens watch over the in-between places, the spaces where neither side can claim the ground. You live in such a place now, whether you wanted to or not. She left without ceremony. He watched her descend until the snow swallowed her shape. Then he returned inside and sat by his fire. The 2 carvings watched him from the shelf, the wolf and the raven, symbols of people who saw him not as a coward, but something else, something he had not yet named. The settlement did not send anyone up the hill again. When spring came and the snow melted, he saw that many had left the valley entirely. Those who remained kept their distance. He was no longer part of their story, and they were no longer part of his. But sometimes in the early morning he would find things at the base of the hill: food, firewood, a new axe with a handle carved from ash, gifts left without signature. From the north or the south, he could not say. Perhaps from both. He carried water up the hill in silence. His boots pressed into earth that remembered the weight of snow and the warmth of people who had filled a small space with their breathing. He did not look back at the valley. He never did. But now, when he reached his door, he paused and set the buckets down with care. He looked at the carvings on his shelf and understood that isolation was not the same as being alone, that a man could remove himself from the world and still be found by it, that the choice to open a door in the storm was not weakness, but the only strength that mattered. The wind moved through the high places. The sky stretched gray and endless, and on the hill where a man once hid from the weight of other people's wars, he stood in the doorway of a hut that had become something more than shelter. It had become a place where the world learned that some men do not choose sides, they choose mercy. And that choice, quiet and uncelebrated, changes everything it touches. He closed the door and returned to his fire. The smoke rose through the broken roof and disappeared into the sky. Somewhere in the valley below, life continued its stumbling march toward whatever came next. And on the hill, a man who had been called a coward sat in silence and knew that he had finally done something worth the name he would never hear them call him: brave.